Will Sean Payton close a deal with former Jaguars tight end Evan Engram to be his potential new Joker here in Denver? Has the free agency market as a whole already kind of dried up for the Denver Broncos? Nikola Jokic once again makes history, but is he too far behind in the NBA MVP race to be a true consideration for the award? And plus another special guest for our Mile High Milestones countdown, celebrating 30 years of Denver Sports 104.3 The Fan. All things to come on today's rundown, but I want to begin in the NFL, where this morning we saw the beginning of one of the greatest oxymorons or nonsensical phrases in all of sports, and that is the legal tampering period for the NFL, where teams are now allowed to legally do something that is illegal, which would be tampering. They can converse with teams who have pending free agents on expiring contracts and begin to work out deals ahead of the official start of free agency later this week. The legal tampering period didn't start until Monday, but we got a ton of news on Saturday and Sunday about things that would officially happen when the legal tampering period begins. And the Broncos have made a handful of moves, but nothing as splashy as maybe some here in Broncos country would like. We saw the likes of Davante Adams signing with the Los Angeles Rams, replacing Cooper Kupp, which is funny because the Los Angeles Rams don't want to pay a 30-plus-year-old wide receiver a lot of money, so they let Cooper Kupp walk just to sign a 30-year-old wide receiver in Davante Adams and give him a multi-year deal. We saw DK Metcalf, who said he wanted to get traded or play somewhere that's in a warmer climate for a contender with a quarterback, and he goes to the Pittsburgh Steelers, which is, of course, a colder Midwestern climate with a lot of uncertainty and no real answer as of now at the quarterback position. So if that doesn't tell you that money tells all in the NFL and probably in life in general, there's your evidence right there. But as it relates to the Denver Broncos, there's some whispers that they may have a deal pursuing with safety Talanoa Hufanga out of the New York Jets. And Evan Engram, who we'll get to in a little bit, is making an official visit to the Broncos today. But in terms of moves they have made, we've got a couple here so far in the early windows. We saw over the weekend that they agreed to terms with DJ Jones to help solidify their front four on a 3-year deal, who just came off of a 3-year deal this offseason. Jared Stidham. Sean Payton signed Jared Stidham 2 years ago when he came to town to be Russell Wilson's backup, paid him a decent backup quarterback salary to do so. And the question we were all asking was, what is the quarterback going to look like next year behind Bo Nix, with Stidham and Wilson both pending free agents? Sean Payton elects to keep the room the same, keeping Jared Stidham as the backup quarterback. And while you might say, hey, there are probably more talented options out there, be it a Case Keenum or a Jacoby Brissett or a Gardner Minshew, right? There are names out there at backup quarterback who may be better than Jared Stidham, but I actually don't hate keeping the quarterback who's already been in your system, who you handpicked from before your current starter was even there, who you benched Russell Wilson in favor of at the end of his tenure here with the Broncos. I am actually okay with the Broncos bringing Jared Stidham back, keeping the continuity in that quarterback room, who seemed to work well, and whatever mentorship role Jared Stidham may have provided to Bo Nix, if any, it seemed to work out well. So I'm fine with that. There's also been whispers from Mike Kliss and others that the Broncos may look to bring back Zach Wilson as well, although the opportunity for Zach Wilson to go somewhere where he has a better chance to start than being an emergency or third-string quarterback here in Denver may prove to be too much for him to pass up, especially if the money is also a little bit there, better there as well. They also brought back a sneaky signing that came down just in the last hour or so, re-signing offensive tackle Matt Peart to a 2-year deal. He played in all 17 games last year as the Broncos swing tackle and was a really reliable backup at that position. Now, thankfully, and knock on wood, that it happens again this year, the Broncos were not super needy to rely on depth at the offensive tackle position, but he was a guy who shored up and plugged the hole left by Alex Forsyth, most infamously against the Chiefs game on the field goal unit for special teams. And I don't think you understand, or we can truly appreciate, how much value there is at backup offensive tackle or offensive line in general until you need it. And we've seen the Broncos have to dig deep into the offensive line bag in years past. Hopefully they don't have to again this year, but I think that re-signing Matt Pert as the backup swing tackle who can be kind of a versatile piece for you on offense and on special teams, definitely an underrated move so far for the Broncos in free agency. The amount of splashy moves, though, that it may make available for the Broncos in terms of this free agent market, they're drying up. I mean, we saw the Broncos needed help at inside linebacker, help at tight end, and help at wide receiver. All of those needs still exist, and it was a matter of how do you address it in the draft versus free agency, which comes first. Well, over this past weekend, we saw a lot of the big names as it relates to targets the Broncos may be looking for re-sign with their team. Zach Bond going back to the Eagles, Nick Bolton re-signing with the Chiefs, even guys like Jamie and Sherwood, who are like kind of middle tier level inside linebackers for the New York Jets that we heard Mark Schlereth and others here at our station kind of shower praises upon. He re-signs with his team. In the tight end market, Zach Ertz staying with the Commanders, Mike Gesicki staying with the Bengals. I don't know how they expect to pay Jamar Chase, franchise tag T. Higgins, sign Mike Gesicki back to a deal, and do it at the expense of some defensive players there in Cincinnati, but they do. So there's another one. We saw this morning Chris Godwin off the market in the wide receiver room. I already mentioned Devontae Adams and DK Metcalf and other big names that maybe the Broncos weren't even in on. But you look at Aaron Jones at the running back position, re-signing with his team. It just feels like with this free agency class, by and large, the vibe from the players and the teams was that we're interested in keeping our own guys. Whereas last free agency cycle, especially at the running back position, we saw such a changing of hands as it relates to star players going to their going away from their current team for a fresh start. We're not getting that very much this offseason. And that leads me to kind of feel this way as it relates to the Broncos. I'm actually okay if the Broncos don't walk away with more than maybe one, maybe two free agency signings in this period, because it just feels like the more these players start to go back to their original teams, that pool's going to dry up. Free agency is already a situation where you're paying A+ money for hopefully B or B+ talent. And so if I'm the Broncos, I don't want to have to chase that in a shallow pool. You know, then am I paying A- money for C or C+ level talent as the bigger names start to go off the board? I think this is a team built around a young quarterback with the minds that you have in the building, especially George Payton, that can do more damage in the draft and more help to plug some of the holes that this team needs than just grabbing bodies in free agency just to grab them. That being said, as it relates to Evan Engram, that is somebody that I do think the Broncos would be wise to try to lock a deal down with. We know that he is going to be visiting the building today. And if all goes well, maybe he doesn't leave there as a free agent still on the market. We know that teams in the past have tried to use that strategy and just, hey, do what it takes. Don't let him leave the building. Lock it down. I think that he presents among the available free agent tight ends that are left. Evan Engram is at the top of that list. You look at players, like I said, like Zach Ertz and Mike Gesicki and even Austin Hooper and the like who are out there. Of the names that are left, you have like a Tyler Conklin and others potentially, Juwan Johnson, the former Saint, Jordan Akins, and Hunter Long. Evan Ingram's at the top of that list. He is somebody that just 2 seasons ago, had over 100 receptions for almost 1,000 yards and a handful of touchdowns. He is somebody that presents the ceiling to be a joker type player for Sean Payton in the receiving game. And we've seen some of the better examples of Sean Payton's jokers be tight ends, from Jimmy Graham to Jeremy Shockey and the like. So I think this is an intriguing option among the shallow pool of free agents that continues to kind of dry up by the hour now that the legal tampering window is here. I think Evan Engram is one of the few options that I would say, hey, let's make a splash move. Let's try to bring in a guy like this. And if it doesn't work, maybe you go after a Juwan Johnson, somebody who's played with Sean Payton in his system before, who's a couple years younger than an Evan Engram. But I don't know. I understand that. I think it becomes easy because of the way Sean Payton has acted with this team in the past, that it's just anytime a former Saint hits the market, it's, well, we're going to bring him in. He's going to be the next little Jordan Humphrey or Chris Manhertz or what have you. But I'm not 100% certain, mainly because they just really haven't spoken any interest about it, or we haven't heard a lot of reporting in a positive nature. that I don't know that Sean Payton is as high on Juwan Johnson maybe as we might like to connect dots because of their former connections than New Orleans. So if it's not Evan Engram and they're not that high on Juwan Johnson, again, I just go back to maybe we don't need to go out and bring in bodies in free agency if it doesn't line up. I think that the Broncos are in a unique position where they have to be decisive and kind of intentional with their moves because they're maximizing a star in the making, skilled quarterback on a rookie contract, but also not having to chase in a sense because there are still a lot of holes to plug on this roster on both sides of the football. And they don't need to go out there and just make moves just to make them, if that makes sense. As it relates to the Denver Nuggets, Nikola Jokic, stop me if you've heard this before, had another historic night. He made history as again in the overtime win, 149-141 over the Phoenix Suns. Nikola Jokic recorded the first ever 30-20-20 game in NBA history. He just broke the plane of 30 points with 32. He had 21 rebounds and a career-high 22 assists. It was the most assists in a game ever by a center, passing Wilt Chamberlain, obviously the most in his career, but just one short of the franchise record for the Nuggets, which was held by Fat Lever, who was in the building to be honored that night, ironically, as a Nuggets legend. So Nikola Jokic, again, it's not something that we are unfamiliar with here in the Mile High City. He is having, for a 3-time MVP, should probably be 4-time MVP. He's arguably having the greatest season of his career, and it continues to kind of leave us questions about how far this team can go with Jokic playing the way that he is, and if the supporting cast around him, primarily Jamal, MPJ, and Aaron Gordon, who's been having some, again, lingering issues injury-wise that have kept him out the last few games, how far this team can go in a postseason run this year. But while an NBA championship may still be in reach for the Nuggets in theory as they kind of continue to battle at near the top of the Western Conference standings behind Oklahoma City, I don't know that Nikola Jokic, as crazy as it sounds, is still in the MVP race for consideration this season. Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, for the majority of the season, has been an overwhelming favorite. The last straw poll done by ESPN showed SGA receiving 70% of the first place votes. Now, Nikola Jokic received all of the remaining 30%. And while the odds of MVP from a gambling perspective for SGA were cut in half after Nikola Jokic's historic 30-20-20 game, SGA still sits as an overwhelming favorite despite that. And we've seen the kind of market correction creep back after Oklahoma City beat the Nuggets just this past weekend. We'll see the rubber match again this week to see if they can kind of even things out. But I do think I sat in this very chair with Will Peterson sitting right here to my left, and I told him months ago, I just don't know that Nikola Jokic is going to be able to have a shot to realistically win the MVP this year, no matter what he does. And that, even with some brief, maybe momentary glimpses of thought that might change, that has by and large been the case. And I know that it's something that's frustrating for a lot of people in Nuggets Nation. It's frustrating for me. Not as frustrating because he's won 3 of the last 4. But it does feel like this is just the reality that we have to face now that Jokic has been let into the club of MVP players, where we were banging doors and lighting pitchforks and lanterns beforehand, pre-COVID, to let him into that club. Now that he's in there, I think we have to kind of accept the reality that the NBA is just going to do this as it relates to their MVP award. The voters are going to vote this way. And then Nikola Jokic, who as a 3-time MVP and the greatest player in the league, is having the greatest season of his career and is more deserving probably than Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, it's going to probably and almost certainly go to SGA. And whether you want to say it's because it's his turn or because of narratives pushed by the mainstream national media and the leagues themselves, because Nikola Jokic does not and has not and probably will never fit the archetype, the mold of what the NBA wants to model its superstar, its face of the league around. Whatever reason you want to attribute it to, that's probably going to be the case. And it's a shame because it flies in the face of my definition of MVP, which is to stick to the phrasing of the most valuable player And looking at Nikola Jokic, whose Nuggets are one of the best teams offensively and overall team rating wise when he's on the court, and genuinely the worst, if not one of the worst in NBA history when he's off the court, that to me is the quintessential definition of value. He's the best player in the league. He's the most valuable player in the league. And the reality is there just aren't that many MVP worthy players in the NBA. And that's at least how I look at it. But that's not good for business from the NBA's perspective, because they want there to be guessing and controversy and options to weigh, because it fuels debate, it fuels discussion, and it generates buzz around their league. But just like I think Nikola Jokic should have won the MVP 4 straight times, he should win it a 5th straight time this year. If it was in my hypothetical world, I would say that about multiple eras of basketball. I think Michael Jordan was the most valuable player in the league for most of the years that he was there, especially the 6 years that they won championship titles. LeBron James, for the middle part of his career, probably should have won MVP every year. Kobe Bryant would have had an argument to win several in a row, more than he did. But the point is, that's just boring, I think, from the NBA's perspective. And that doesn't generate the kind of buzz and attention and discussion that these professional sports leagues want to keep their product relevant and on the minds of its viewers. So my stance on it hasn't changed. I don't believe that Nikola Jokic will win the MVP award. I will happily continue to bang the drum that he should, even if no one's listening. But that's kind of how I see things shaking out for the Denver Nuggets. And the hope is that if Nikola Jokic, if and when he doesn't win the MVP, that the Nuggets as a team follow the same trajectory that happened the last time he was robbed of an MVP award, which is go on to win the NBA Finals, and Jokic gets to put another Finals MVP trophy on his case. All right, enough of that. It is time for the latest installment of our Mile High Milestones feature, presented by your local Ford dealers, counting down the 30 biggest storylines of the last 30 years in recognition of Denver Sports 104.3 The Fan's 30th birthday, 30th anniversary, 30th year on the airwaves, sharing sports news and stories with you. And today's milestone, number 25, we land on the lengthy Broncos ownership saga. And to take this trip down memory lane with us, I want to welcome in our friend of the show and Denver Post star, Troy Rank. Troy, always great to talk to you, my man. How you doing?
Doing great, Richie. Thanks for having me on.
Of course. Troy, you have been in this market for a significant length of time, covering multiple different sports franchises, and really have been able to chronicle some of the pivotal years in the last decade or so with the Broncos, as they've gone from Super Bowl champions to kind of the NFL basement and all of the ownership drama and saga and quarterback carousel drama that's unfolded over the last 7 or 8 seasons. So, Troy, now that we are in this era with the Walton Penner Group, when you look back on where we were 7, 8 years ago with the stepping down of Pat Bowlen due to degenerative health reasons and the establishment of the infamous Broncos ownership trust, what stands out to you the most about that saga now that its final chapter has been closed?
That family drama is not different at the millions and billion-dollar level. That, so many of us in our life, or those we know, have family drama. A lot of times it's connected to money. And the reality is, when there's a divorce involved, it became a Shakespearean drama with the Broncos. That, you had Beth Bowlen, you had 2 Bowlen girls wanting the ownership, one side on here, one side there. They were never going to agree on one voice. That was the problem the whole time, is you had 2 legitimate candidates. Beth was, for me, the best. They were never going to agree on her. And what's unfortunate about that is when it became very clear, and the league was gentle with them because of their respect for Pat Bowlen and the family, but the chaos became too far to ignore when, you have relative Bowlen members spouting off to the press and making it public. And at that time, the NFL finally gets involved, Richie, and says, enough. Like, you need to pick somebody, or you need to put this thing up for sale. And it's unfortunate that they just didn't come to that realization sooner. I get why they didn't. They like the football and they want to be involved. But honestly, it's the best thing that could ever happen is they get paid. The legacy of Pat Bowlen is secure. And you turn over to an ownership group that's been rated among the top 4 or 5 the last 2 years in the Player Association poll, and has the deepest pockets of any owner. So if the Bolin family had taken over, there is no way for me it was going to end well because of the infighting and the lack of financial resources that eventually would have bit them. This allows them to go on. The legacy is protected. Pat Bolin, the Hall of Fame legacy is protected. And the Walton Penner Group, imagine that, Richie. You walk in and replace a Hall of Fame owner. Now, he wasn't active. I understand that. But it's a premier franchise that not only are you replacing a Hall of Fame owner with those expectations, you're doing so in replacing this vacuum where the fans are losing their minds and angry over how the team's being run. You could tell that the dysfunction at ownership had reached the front office and it was affecting the play on the field. And so in a lot of ways, it worked out the way it was supposed to, but I never would have thought it would have taken that long. And it did. But again, in a weird way, it's the perfect ending that you end up with the Walton Penner ownership group to take this into the future.
Yeah, and you mentioned kind of the family drama, the Shakespearean nature of it. And I think that in and of itself would have been enough to make this like an eyebrow-raising kind of storyline. But I think what really elevates it into another stratosphere for me, and you mentioned a little bit with the legacy of Pat Bolin. I mean, the Broncos came off of an ownership tenure with Pat Bolin that you can maybe say, people around the country wouldn't have rated it as highly because they're not as close to it. And you always get that when there's national versus local. But Pat Bolin was instrumental from a local level here with what he was able to do with the Broncos and his commitment to winning and excellence. In my opinion, the standard that we have here in Broncos country doesn't exist without Pat Bolin's just incessant, obsessive nature with winning, his desire to, even though he wasn't among the wealthiest owners in the NFL by a pretty decent stretch, he would beg, borrow, and steal and bend rules and wink, wink, nod, nod to be able to manipulate things to make sure that the Broncos were always contenders. And I think that, generations from this day forward are going to uphold that standard that never would have existed without him. So to go from that, where you had a situation where you had more Super Bowl appearances than losing seasons at the time that he stepped down, and you're right, with the Bolin children, obviously in any kind of family wealth dynamic, the passing down from generation to generation, from father to daughter, father to son, what have you. And it's not like there were a shortage of options for Pat Bolin in terms of children or next of kin that he could have handed it off to. But, the all sense making heir apparent Johnny Bolin, the blood of the city, goes in a complete opposite direction from what you can have from an ownership perspective in terms of off-field and on-field, distractions and things of that nature. And then, the Beth versus Brittany debate. And there was the dynamic of, how involved would you be if you took over, and what would the role look like? And does your background match something that we think can be conducive? And then you have like the Game of Thronesian nature of that article that comes out where there's a love child now involved. And how does it complicate the splitting of the trust and the payments? And even amongst the infighting with the siblings, it's like, okay, yeah, we want to get paid, but who's going to get what and what price and this and that? It's just one of those situations where to go from this, where you were so high up, to as low as they've gotten, some of the worst Broncos football in franchise history, the worst stretch, to then rebound with the Walton Penner ownership group, the richest owner in professional sports, and the distance between number one and number two is worth more than the net worth of number two in terms of the gap. So, Troy, now that we are here in a position with the Walton Penner ownership group, and we've seen how big of an impact they've made in just 2 seasons, where they were not NFL or professional sports involved prior to this. So even drinking through a fire hose, the way that Greg Penner has in his first season and now into his second season, how far back do you think, or how much different would the Broncos' last 8 years have been if they had put this trust situation to bed maybe in year 1 or 2 versus the 7 or 8 that it finally took? I mean, if we're obviously playing butterfly effect here, but just how different would the Broncos look if we got a sale and perhaps it was the Walton Penner Group, or maybe it wasn't, 6 years ago instead of 2 years ago?
Yeah, well, I think where you look at it, would it have affected the Josh Allen draft? I don't know, because Greg Penner allows football people to make football decisions. I will say this. Getting to know Greg Penner, doing a couple of one-on-ones with him this past year, lengthy one-on-ones with him, I don't think there's any way that Nathaniel Hackett gets hired.
Right.
And that was happening in this vacuum with Joe Ellis kind of absent and George Payton, who's really good at scouting, really good at some of this football stuff, but he was delegating too much authority in this collaborative effort. You end up with a coach that was not qualified, and he basically was hired because he was the antithesis of Vic Fangio. I don't see a scenario where Greg Penner would have signed off on that because of how he runs his business, he and Kerry, about accountability and this drive. I just think that they would have found Nathaniel Hackett interesting, but man, he's like a consultant you bring in once every 6 months. You don't bring him in to coach the team. And they wanted Harbaugh, they wanted Peyton, they wanted a specific type. So how do I think it's different? I mean, you'd have to go through, like you said, who was available. They wouldn't have had a bunch of first year coaches in a row. Now, again, they were really impressed with escaping my name, the guy from Houston, but they wouldn't have had like 3 consecutive 1-year coaches. It just wouldn't have happened under the Penner, under the Walton Penner group. And so that would have been different. The Russell Wilson contract is their one mistake. They approved it. Like, they weren't spearheading it. They inherited the team in August, and literally like 3 weeks later, so that was around like August 8th, 10th, and a couple of weeks later, before they go to Seattle, Russell has a new deal. I will always tell people it was kind of the understanding when you give up essentially 7 assets, he was going to get a new deal, and they approved that new deal. But the difference in this ownership than past, they admit the mistake. And immediately when they had a chance after Sean Payton of 1 year, I talked to Greg Penner about this. I'm like, man, Greg, I'll be honest, not many owners would have the humility to admit that mistake. And his was like, why would we continue going forward with something that doesn't work? You know, it's like, he's like, the worst thing you can do in owning a business is let's do this because that's the way we've always done it. He said, Sean, talk to me. It wasn't working. We eat it and we move on. And that is a huge difference. There's no way if the Bolins are in charge or that they would eat that money. They just wouldn't have had the financial wherewithal where the Waltons can say, we'll write this check. Russell Wilson got $119 million guaranteed to go 11-19. Like, it's just an insane amount of money, but they have it. They don't spend it as like crazy, but they have it. So how would it have been different? You would have just seen more accountability. You see now, like, I wasn't sure George Payton and Sean Payton would work well together. They work well together because they were both report to Greg Penner. And they both have so much respect for Penner. Penner has made Sean Payton not only a better coach, but a better person in the way he sees the world. And Greg, and it's made George Payton, he's always been good, but it's made him very linear in his role. For me, he's almost like a scouting director. So it works because they're both reporting to this guy who's at practice every day. Greg Penner is around. And that's the thing I love. That's how, when I covered Pat Bowlen, you'd see him on the field every day. Like, he's in the field, and then every Friday he's running the college football pool, voting, every year picking Oklahoma to go undefeated. But that's how competitive he was. Got to know the players. He had a relationship with them. Penner and Greg and Kerry are there a lot. They sit down in the cafeteria randomly with players. What do you need? How's it going? How can we help? That's where it's very similar to the Bowlen effect of you feel the accountability. When I talk to players about it, Richie, they're like, man, they will do anything for us. And it was just, that's how Bowlen was. That's how Shanahan was. And that's, you're starting to see that now, that the players know if you do things the right way around here, they're going to take care of you. But don't confuse that with sentimentality. Like, it's not that. But if you do things the right way, you fit, you get paid, and you're part of it. And you see that. That's why, like, when they got rid of Michael Wilhoit, the coach, it stinks. But I loved it because this is who this ownership group is. Gather the facts. It's not always going to be the same, but we got to move on. We can't have distractions. We're trying to get to a championship here. We hope this guy coaches again. We believe he will. It can't be here. And you saw it with Josh Reynolds. Quietly move on from him. That's, I'm not saying it wasn't his fault, but he put himself in position to get into an incident. Quietly gets cut. So they're very clearly, Richie, establishing how they do business. It's not always going to be this way. There's gray areas in these situations, but that's how Bowlen was. Bowlen was much more willing to take chances on people, a little bit of renegades. So I don't think this ownership would. I'd be surprised, but they're very similar in accountability and demanding excellence. And just because you were good last year, you got to, show me how you're going to be better next year. They create that, and they're out there every day. So don't think you're fooling them. If you think you're going to go to a meeting with Greg Penner And, like they do with Dick Monfort over at the Rockies. Oh, these prospects, I'm telling you, there's this guy in Class A, and you're not doing that with Greg Penner. Trust me. He is one of the brightest guys I've ever been around in any situation. So that's why I think they're in really good hands. It doesn't mean that it's always going to be perfect. And they have a huge, huge shadow with Pat Bowlen. He was a Hall of Fame owner in every way. But if you're in Broncos country, you have to feel good about the direction of this team right now and where they're going.
I couldn't agree more. And you touched on some of the qualities that I was going to close up with in terms of if I had to identify one trait or characteristic about the Greg Penner and the Walton Penner ownership group that I think gives me the most optimism about the future, it is that wisdom and that knowledge about how to be like decisively passive, how to know when to let football guys do football things and when to step in and make a decision for the betterment of establishing a culture and a standard and an expectation that everyone in turn is able to follow. That's something that the trust was never able to do. It was a rudderless ship floating in the wind. And there was personal interest that maybe disagreed with the best interest for the team and things of that nature, or with conflicts of interest. But with this group, I mean, you've seen it, and the manifestation of it that I think best encompasses it is you were able to erase nearly a decade of some of the worst football in the franchise's long history in a span of 2 years.
Right.
And while doing so, establish alignment and continuity from ownership to front office to head coach and now quarterback. That is literally the pillar of which every NFL team looks to align themselves. And this group, this man and this ownership group as a collective managed to do it in 2 years, what a collection of 5 or 6 other people who had their hands in the pot weren't able to do in nearly 8. So I couldn't agree with you more. I think that the brightest thing about the Broncos right now, as bright as Bo Nix is, and that's going to have to be something that we hope continues to flicker brighter and brighter from years to come. But there is no opportunity to light the candle for Bo Nix without the Walton Penner ownership group arranging things and laying out the foundation on the back end. Troy, thank you so much for joining us today. It's always a pleasure to chat with you. And as someone who has been here covering the thick of all of this stuff for as long as you have, there is nobody better to kind of take this complicated, twisted HBO level walk down memory lane as it relates to the Broncos ownership group. So thank you very much. We'll keep an eye on all the reporting at the Denver Post and things you have going on as a busy free agency week kind of continues. And I can't wait to catch up again soon, man.
Sounds good, Richie. Thanks for having me on. Take care.
Of course. So all the rest of you out there, have a great rest of your day, and we'll catch you at the same time, same place tomorrow.
I do what I love what I do. Second nature to put in the